Montana Territory, 1882. The vast, unforgiving prairie stretched before Kane Ryder's weathered eyes as he surveyed what remained of his father's legacy. The Ryder Ranch had once been the pride of Clearwater County, but 4 years of drought and his father's passing had left the 25-year-old with little more than debt and dying cattle. Not a wife in the world could fix this mess, Kane muttered to himself, adjusting his Stetson against the relentless summer sun. He believed it with every fiber of his being, that a man alone stood the best chance of survival on the frontier. His father had taught him that lesson through bitter experience. After Kane's mother died during the journey west when he was just 7 years old, his father never remarried. Instead, Thomas Ryder had raised his son on hard work, harder whiskey, and the conviction that emotional attachments were liabilities on the frontier. Caring just gives this land another way to break you, his father would say. The philosophy had served Kane well enough. Standing just over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders honed from years of ranch work, his clean-shaven face and striking blue eyes might have made him the target of many hopeful glances from young women in town, but Kane remained steadfastly alone. His youthful handsomeness was marred only by the perpetual furrow between his brows, the mark of a man who trusted no one but himself. Kane wanted only what he could control, to rebuild the ranch, to prove that a man could tame this wild country through sheer determination. Love, marriage, family. These were distractions he couldn't afford, complications that would only lead to heartbreak in a land where death lurked behind every beautiful vista. What he needed was rain, not a wife. What he needed were strong cattle, not tender emotions. What he needed was solitude to focus on survival, not the complications of sharing his life with someone else. But the land had other plans for Kane Ryder. The stagecoach rattled violently as it hit another rut in the barely passable road, jolting its passengers. 20-year-old Violet Abernathy clutched her journal tightly, her knuckles white beneath her lace gloves. Her honey-blonde hair, usually neatly pinned beneath her green bonnet, had come loose during the jarring journey, with several strands now framing her heart-shaped face. "Not much farther to Clearwater, miss," the driver called down, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "Another hour or so." Violet nodded, though no one could see her. 6 days of travel from Chicago had left her exhausted, but determination shone in her green eyes. She was not some delicate flower of society, despite her fine blue traveling dress and proper manners. She was Thomas Ryder's niece, and she had a promise to keep. Her uncle's letter had arrived 3 months after his death, delayed by the inefficient frontier postal service. "Should anything happen to me," he had written, "the ranch belongs to Kane, but he'll need help whether he admits it or not. He's as stubborn as the land itself." The stagecoach rounded a bend, and Violet caught her first glimpse of Clearwater, a dusty collection of wooden buildings that barely constituted a town. Her life in Chicago, with its elegant mansions and paved streets, seemed worlds away. A sudden commotion ahead caused the driver to pull the horses to an abrupt halt. Violet peered out the window to see 3 riders blocking the road, bandanas covering their faces. "Road agents," the driver shouted. Violet's heart pounded. She had read about bandits in dime novels, but never expected to face them herself. As the men approached with guns drawn, she quickly slipped her mother's gold locket beneath her dress and tucked her small purse into her boot. The door was yanked open. "Step out, folks. Nice and easy." Kane was returning from town with desperately needed supplies when he heard the commotion. Gunshots echoed across the plains. Urging his horse forward, he crested a small rise to see a stagecoach surrounded by 3 masked men, while passengers stood with their hands raised. His first instinct was to ride on. Frontier justice was clear on this matter. Mind your own business if you wanted to stay alive. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the flash of a blue dress, out of place in the dusty landscape, or perhaps it was simply that he'd had enough of watching bad men take what didn't belong to them. Kane drew his Winchester from its saddle holster and approached at a gallop. "That's far enough," he called out, leveling his rifle. The bandits spun, startled by the unexpected intervention. One fired wildly in Kane's direction, the bullet whistling past his ear. Kane returned fire, striking the man in the shoulder. The wounded bandit dropped his gun, clutching his bleeding arm. "Next one goes through your heart," Kane shouted, chambering another round. The outlaws exchanged glances, then quickly mounted their horses, dragging their wounded companion with them. They disappeared into the hills, leaving behind the shaken passengers. Kane dismounted, approaching cautiously. Everyone all right? That's when he saw her clearly, a young woman unlike any he'd encountered in Clearwater. Her blonde hair caught the sunlight, and despite the ordeal, she stood tall, her green eyes assessing him with surprising composure. "I believe we're unharmed, thanks to your timely arrival," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement. "I'm Violet Abernathy." Kane froze at the name. Abernathy? Any relation to Thomas Ryder? "His niece," she replied, brushing dust from her dress. "And you must be my cousin Kane." Kane felt like he'd been kicked by a horse. "Cousin? My pa never mentioned any family back east. He and my mother had a falling out years ago," Violet explained. "But we corresponded in his final years." She hesitated, then added, "He asked me to come." Kane's jaw tightened. The last thing he needed was some city girl claiming kinship and complicating his already desperate situation. "Well, Miss Abernathy, I don't know what my father promised you, but the ranch is barely surviving. There's nothing for you here." Violet lifted her chin. "I didn't come for inheritance, Mr. Ryder. I came because a dying man asked for my help." "I don't need help," Kane declared flatly, especially not from a woman who looked like she'd never seen a day of honest work. "And I certainly don't need a wife, if that's what he had in mind." Color rose in Violet's cheeks. "I assure you, marriage is the furthest thing from my thoughts. I simply intend to honor my uncle's request." The stagecoach driver interrupted their tense exchange. "Miss, we need to continue to town before those bandits return with friends." Kane tipped his hat stiffly. "Town's 4 miles ahead. The ranch is 5 miles west of there. Do yourself a favor and take the next stage back east." As he mounted his horse, Violet called after him, "I'll see you soon, cousin." Kane rode away without looking back, unaware that this woman would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about survival in the West. The Ryder Ranch looked even more dilapidated up close than it had appeared from a distance. Violet stood before the 2-story farmhouse, taking in the peeling paint and sagging porch. A week had passed since her arrival in Clearwater, during which she'd taken a room at the boarding house and gathered information about her cousin and his struggling ranch. What she learned only strengthened her resolve. The bank was 3 months from foreclosure. The cattle were dying from some unknown ailment. And Kane Ryder worked from dawn until dusk with no help, having fired the last ranch hand months ago when he couldn't pay wages. Violet straightened her simple brown work dress and knocked firmly on the door. When no answer came, she walked around to the back, where she found Kane struggling to repair a broken water pump. "Good morning, cousin," she called cheerfully. Kane looked up, his face darkening at the sight of her. Sweat dampened his shirt, and a smudge of grease marked his forehead, but even disheveled, Violet couldn't help noting his handsome features. "I thought I made myself clear," he said, turning back to the pump. "You did. I simply chose not to listen." Violet approached, setting down the basket she carried. "I've brought lunch, and some of my mother's medicinal tinctures that might help your cattle." Kane scoffed. "Tinctures? The cattle need grass and water, not Eastern snake oil." "Actually," Violet replied, kneeling beside the broken pump, "they may be suffering from alkali poisoning. The symptoms you described to Mr. Henderson at the general store match what my father treated in his veterinary practice." This caught Kane's attention. "Your father was a veterinarian?" "Yes, and he taught me everything he knew." Violet reached for a wrench. "May I?" Reluctantly, Kane handed it over and watched in surprise as Violet deftly tightened a fitting that had eluded him for hours. Water began to flow. "How did you? Machines follow rules, Mr. Ryder. Once you understand the principles, gender becomes irrelevant." She stood, brushing dust from her hands. "Now, about those cattle. I'd like to examine them." Kane studied her for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. "1 cow. You can look at 1 cow. Then we'll see." By sunset, Violet had diagnosed alkali poisoning, administered treatment to 5 of the sickest animals, and prepared a meal that made Kane realize how poorly he'd been feeding himself. Still, he maintained his distance, watching her with guarded eyes. "Why are you really here?" he asked finally, as they sat on the porch. "There's nothing for you in this godforsaken place." Violet looked out at the vast landscape painted golden by the setting sun. "Uncle Thomas wrote that this land could be paradise with the right care. He said it just needed someone who understood it." She turned to Kane. He also said his son was too busy fighting the land to listen to it. Kane bristled. I've listened plenty. All it says is die or leave. Perhaps you're not listening correctly. Violet rose. I'll return tomorrow to check on the cattle. Good night, cousin. As she walked away in the fading light, Kane called after her. I still don't need your help. But 3 of the sick cattle were already showing improvement, and for the first time in months, his stomach was full. Kane watched her go with a mixture of irritation and something he refused to name. Over the following weeks, an uneasy routine developed. Each morning, Violet would arrive at the ranch, and Kane would grumble about not needing help. By midday, they would be working side by side. Kane reluctantly following Violet's veterinary instructions, or Violet learning from Kane about the particular challenges of the land. The cattle began to recover. A repaired windmill brought fresh water to parched fields. And Kane found himself watching the clock, anticipating Violet's arrival each day. One morning, Kane awoke to the sound of hammering. He emerged from the house to find Violet already at work, repairing a broken fence post. What are you doing here so early? He called. Violet looked up, wiping perspiration from her brow. I saw storm clouds building from town. Thought we should secure the north pasture before it hits. We? Kane echoed, the word feeling strange on his tongue. Unless you've changed your mind about accepting help, she replied with a smile that made something twist in his chest. They worked side by side through the morning, racing against the approaching storm. When the rain finally came, they sought shelter in the barn, soaked but triumphant. The cattle would be safe in the repaired pasture. You're not what I expected, Kane admitted as they watched the downpour from the barn door. What did you expect? A helpless city girl who'd faint at the sight of mud? Kane laughed, surprising himself. Something like that. My father believed women were just as capable as men, Violet said, wringing water from her hair. He taught me that knowledge was more valuable than convention. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. Sadness flickered across her face. He died last year. That's partly why I came when I received Uncle Thomas's letter. There was nothing left for me in Chicago. Kane studied her, seeing beyond the capable exterior to the loss they shared. I'm sorry about your father, and I'm sorry about how I've treated you. Thunder crashed overhead, and Violet instinctively stepped closer to Kane. He found himself placing a protective hand on her shoulder. I should get back to town before this worsens, she said, though she made no move to leave. Stay, Kane heard himself say. The guest room is clean enough. It's not safe to travel in this. That night, as rain pounded on the roof, Kane lay awake, listening to the soft sounds of another person in his home. For the first time since his father's death, the house didn't feel empty. And for the first time in years, the thought of not being alone didn't feel like a weakness. Summer gave way to autumn, and the transformation of the Ryder Ranch continued. The recovered cattle fetched good prices at market, allowing Kane to pay down some of his debt. Fields that had lain fallow were prepared for spring planting. And Violet, originally planning to stay only a few weeks, found reasons to postpone her departure. She had moved from the boarding house to the ranch house, occupying the guest room and maintaining strict propriety. But something was changing between them. Lingering glances across the dinner table, hands brushing as they worked side by side, conversations that stretched into the night. The bank's extending my loan, Kane announced one evening as they sat before the fireplace. Henderson says the improvements we've made have convinced them the ranch is a good investment again. That's wonderful news, Violet replied, looking up from her mending. You've worked so hard for this. We've worked hard, Kane corrected, his eyes meeting hers. I couldn't have done it without you, Violet. The use of her first name hung in the air between them, intimate and new. I've been thinking, Kane continued, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Winter's coming, and you still haven't said when you're returning to Chicago. Violet set down her sewing. Do you want me to leave? No, Kane answered quickly, then more deliberately. No, I don't. In fact, I was hoping you might consider staying. Permanently. Violet's heart quickened. As your ranch hand, Kane moved to sit beside her. As my partner. In every sense. Before Violet could respond, a pounding at the door shattered the moment. Kane opened it to find the sheriff standing on the porch. Sorry to disturb you, Ryder, but we've got trouble. Those road agents that have been plaguing the stagecoach. They hit the bank today. Shot Henderson. Is he alive? Kane asked, reaching for his coat. Barely. Doc's with him now. The sheriff glanced at Violet. Evening, Miss Abernathy. They also took the bank records. Might want to check your loan papers, Ryder. After the sheriff left, Kane turned to Violet, his expression grim. I need to go into town. Wait here. I'm coming with you, Violet insisted, already gathering her shawl. This isn't your fight, isn't it? Violet countered. This ranch, this town, they've become my home too. Kane wanted to argue, but recognized the determination in her eyes. They rode into town together, finding it in an uproar. The bank's windows were shattered, and a crowd gathered outside the doctor's office. Inside, Henderson lay pale and still on a bed, his wife clutching his hand. He's asking for you, Mrs. Henderson told Kane, stepping aside. The banker's voice was weak. Ryder, the loan extension, papers were stolen. Don't worry about that now, Kane assured him. You don't understand, Henderson gasped. Without those papers, corporate buyers from back east, they'll take your land when payment comes due next week. Kane felt the floor shift beneath him. Next week? But we agreed on 3 months. Original terms, without signed extension. Henderson's eyes fluttered closed as the doctor ushered them out. Outside, Violet grasped Kane's arm. What does this mean? Kane's face hardened. It means everything we've worked for could be lost in 7 days unless we find those outlaws and recover those papers. The following morning, Kane prepared to join the posse tracking the bank robbers. As he saddled his horse, Violet approached, dressed in riding clothes. You can't come, Kane said firmly. These men are killers. I'm not asking permission, Violet replied, adjusting her hat. Besides, I'm the only one who got a clear look at their faces during the stagecoach robbery. Before Kane could protest further, a rider approached, a man Kane recognized as James Porter, representative of Eastern Capital Investments. Mr. Ryder, Porter called, dismounting. I've come to discuss the transfer of your property. Kane's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. My property isn't for sale. Porter smiled coldly. According to the bank, you'll be in default by week's end. My employers are prepared to offer a fair price, enough to clear your debts and start fresh elsewhere. How convenient that your company appears just as the loan extension disappears, Violet observed, stepping forward. Almost as if you knew the bank would be robbed. Porter's smile faltered momentarily. Business often involves fortunate timing, Miss Abernathy. Violet Abernathy. She studied him intently. You look familiar, Mr. Porter. Have we met before? A flash of recognition crossed Porter's face before he masked it. I don't believe so. I would remember such a perceptive young woman. After Porter rode away, Violet turned to Kane. He was one of them, one of the road agents. His eyes, the scar on his right hand. I'm certain of it. Kane looked toward the horizon where Porter had disappeared. Eastern Capital Investments wants my land badly enough to hire outlaws. It must be worth more than we realize, Violet said. We need to find out why. The sheriff's posse departed without them as Kane and Violet began their own investigation. At the land office, they discovered recent surveys showing a potential railroad spur plan near the ranch, which would make the land's value skyrocket. They're not just stealing your ranch, Violet realized. They're stealing your future. That night, as they pored over maps by lamplight, Kane reached for Violet's hand. I haven't forgotten our conversation before the sheriff arrived. Violet's cheeks colored. This hardly seems the time. It's exactly the time, Kane insisted. I need you to know, whatever happens with the ranch, what I said was true. These past months with you, you've changed everything. Kane, I thought I needed to be alone to survive out here. I was wrong. His fingers tightened around hers. I don't just want you to stay because you've saved the ranch. I want you to stay because... A shot rang out, shattering the window. Kane pulled Violet to the floor as more bullets splintered the wood around them. They crawled to where Kane kept his rifle, returning fire until the attackers retreated. They're getting desperate, Kane said, checking Violet for injuries. We must be getting close to something. Violet clutched his arm, her face pale but resolute. We need to find those loan papers before they destroy them. The next day brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. She arrived pale and trembling. My husband died this morning, she announced, her voice hollow. Before he passed, he told me something. Porter came to the bank the day before the robbery, asking about your loan specifically. She handed Kane a small key. Thomas gave my husband this years ago for safekeeping. Said if anything happened to him, to give it to his son if he ever truly needed it. After Mrs. Henderson left, Kane examined the key. It's to my father's old strongbox. I thought he kept only mementos in it. The box, retrieved from the attic, contained what appeared to be mining surveys and legal documents, along with a letter from Thomas Ryder to his son. Kane, the letter began. If you're reading this, you've likely discovered what I learned too late, that our land sits on one of the richest copper deposits in the territory. I kept it secret, fearing what men would do to take it from us. Trust no one with this knowledge except family. Kane looked up at Violet, his expression stunned. He knew. All this time, he knew what the land was worth. That's why he asked me to come, Violet realized. He knew you'd need someone you could trust. The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the window, they saw Porter returning with his men, this time making no pretense of legitimacy. They were armed and surrounding the house. Kane Ryder, Porter called. We can do this civilized-like. Sign over your claim, and you and the woman can leave unharmed. Kane loaded his rifle, his jaw set. I count 6 of them. 7, Violet corrected, pointing to a man circling behind the barn. We're outnumbered. We might not be. Kane handed her the documents. Take these and my father's letter. Ride for town through the back creek bed where they won't see you. Get the sheriff. Violet shook her head. I won't leave you here alone. Violet, please. Kane took her face in his hands. I need you to do this. I'll hold them off. Their eyes held for a long moment before Violet nodded. Promise me you'll stay alive. I promise. As Violet slipped out the back, Kane stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. This is private property, Porter, or whatever your real name is. Porter smiled coldly. The property of Eastern Capital Investments by week's end. Why not avoid bloodshed? Why wait? Kane challenged. If you want my land, come and take it. The first shots came from Porter's men, splintering the porch railings. Kane returned fire, striking one man in the leg before retreating inside. He moved from window to window, firing strategically to give the impression of multiple defenders. But the outlaws were gradually closing in, and Kane's ammunition was running low. A bullet grazed his arm, another shattered a lantern, setting fire to the curtains. Smoke began to fill the house. Kane thought of Violet riding for help, of all they had built together, of the future that had seemed impossible just months ago. He would not let it end here. Outside, Porter grew impatient. Burn him out, he ordered, and his men threw torches onto the roof. As flames spread across the house, Kane knew he couldn't wait any longer. Clutching his rifle, he prepared for one final stand. The sound of galloping horses made him pause. Through the smoke, he saw riders approaching, the sheriff's posse, with Violet at the front. Gunfire erupted as the lawmen engaged Porter's gang. In the chaos, Kane burst from the burning house, tackling Porter to the ground. They struggled, Porter drawing a knife that slashed across Kane's chest before Kane knocked it away with a powerful blow. It's over, Porter, Kane growled, pressing his forearm against the man's throat. When the shooting stopped, 4 of Porter's men lay dead, 2 were wounded, and the rest had surrendered. The sheriff handcuffed Porter, who glared at Kane with pure hatred. The loan papers were in his saddlebag, the sheriff announced, handing them to Kane, along with telegrams from his employers. Enough evidence to put him away for life. Kane barely heard him. His eyes sought Violet, finding her dismounting nearby. She ran to him, heedless of propriety as she threw her arms around him. You're hurt, she gasped, seeing the blood on his shirt. It's nothing, Kane said, holding her close. Nothing compared to what I would have lost. They turned to watch the house, the home his father had built, collapsing in flames. We can rebuild, Violet said softly. Kane looked down at her, his heart full. Yes, we can. Spring 1883. The new Ryder Ranch house stood complete, larger and sturdier than its predecessor. The copper rights had been properly filed, with the first mining leases bringing enough money to transform the struggling ranch into one of the territory's most prosperous. On the wide front porch, Violet arranged flowers for the tables while neighbors and townspeople gathered in the yard. Her wedding dress, simple but elegant, caught the breeze as she worked. Nervous? Kane asked, stepping behind her and placing his hands on her shoulders. Violet turned in his arms. Not at all. Are you? Kane smiled, no longer the hardened man who had once declared he had no need for a wife. Only that I might wake up and find this all a dream. Not a dream, Violet assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him lightly. A future. As they stood together watching their guests arrive, Kane thought about the letter his father had left, not just the part about the copper, but the final lines he had shared only with Violet. Son, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I lived most of my life believing the frontier was no place for love, that a man must stand alone to survive. I was wrong. It was loneliness, not love, that nearly destroyed me. If Violet has come as I asked, trust her. She carries your mother's spirit in her heart, though they never met. And remember, the land doesn't care if you conquer it. It only thrives when you love it enough to listen. The minister called for them to take their places. Before them stretched the ranch lands, green with spring promise. Behind them stood the community that had become family. And beside them, each had found what the frontier truly offered, not just survival, but a life worth living together. As Kane took Violet's hand to lead her to the makeshift altar, he whispered, "Thank you for saving my dying ranch." Violet smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you for letting me." In the vast Montana sky above them, clouds parted to reveal endless blue, a heaven bearing witness to a love that had not just survived the frontier, but transformed it into home.